Hello everyone, this is the video on factor analysis in SPSS. And I'm going to go through the file that I used in class when I went over this topic. It's based on the data from my fake project data. I just kind of expanded it. You have some data in here. These are entrepreneurs. You have their business income, their years in business, their age, gender. Then there's really two sets of four variables. The first one's entrepreneurial intensity, and we talked about, that's something that's an attitude that's measured commonly with a multi-item or a multi-question measure. And I talked about the four questions that were used. If you're curious to what those are, you can look at my example project that actually spells those out. But they're asking people basically how devoted they are to their business. The responses are on a 5-point Likert scale, which we can assume is interval level measurement 5. Basically, we code strongly disagree 1, disagree 1, neutral 3, agree 4, strongly agree 5. You can see that for all four of the entrepreneurial intensity questions, which make up the measure. And to measure entrepreneurial intensity, what you do is you use the four questions, which have been used in the previous research, and you just can sum up the how an individual answers them, essentially. And flexibility is a similar type deal. I actually don't remember exactly where I got this from, if there's some sort of four-question measure of how flexible a business is. But anyways, I did, I'm going to change these to scale because we're assuming they're interval. But, probably a similar four-question, four-item measure of how flexible business is. You ask the entrepreneur 4 questions, and that kind of gives you some sort of measure of that. It could be 5, it could be 6. I mean, honestly, a lot of measures of attitudes are more than 4 questions. They might be 5, 6, or 7. But both of these cases, we have 4-item or 4-question scales for the entrepreneurial intensity of the entrepreneur as well as their flexibility. All right. So we talked about, we could sum, the responses from these 4 together and these 4 together. And, if these are previously used measures, they've probably been examined using factor analysis and things like that. But typically it's done where you still look at it yourself, look at your own data and run your factor analysis on it. And I'm going to do that by going to factor. What does factor analysis do? Well, it allows us to make sure that the 4 entrepreneurial intensity questions, items, and the 4 flexibility questions, items are actually measuring the same thing, right? And that they're not measuring each other, that they discriminate from one another is kind of a term that's commonly used. So I'm going to, I selected factor analysis. I'm just going to select all of them and put them all in. There's no need to add the other variables like gender and age. I mean, they're not anything. You don't typically do factor analysis on, you don't. There's no need to do factor analysis on something like age, which you just ask someone their age. It's one question that measures it. It's not an attitude. It's very objective. We don't need to include that in our factor analysis. But we will include the ones we have here. And I'm going to follow the same recommendations I had in my PowerPoint. There are a lot of choices that you make, but there are some common ones which are made, and that's kind of what I'm doing. Principal axis factoring, selecting the scree plot. You don't have to use principal axis factoring. There's a lot of other options, but it's commonly used, and there's some reasons for that. We won't get into those details. Rotation. Oops, it's pulling up on the other screen here. I'm going to do the Varimax, was commonly done. Display the rotated solution. And okay. So it gives us some information up here where we won't really use, but we will use the variance explain. Basically, how SPSS is set up is that tells you how many factors there are. All right, how many underlying things are you actually measuring? Yes, there's 8 questions, but at the end of the day, it's telling us we're measuring 2. And it's actually programmed to automatically blank out the details for a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 factor solution. It gives us a 1-factor solution. With a 1-factor solution, it gives us certain eigenvalues, which we haven't really gotten into. But the interesting thing is percent of variance explained, which is 41.42%. That's pretty high. The second factor adds another 34.28%, which gives us a total of about 75. Adding a third factor does help a little bit, but not all that much. You can actually see that on the scree plot as well. It shows the eigenvalues, not the variance explained, but they're pretty similar. So it's basically telling us a 2-factor solution. In reality, it's a lot more subjective. And again, this is something we talk a lot more in depth, but I don't really want to spend too much time on all the details of factor analysis. I want you to understand what it's used for, essentially, and then you can always figure out the details later. It actually gives us some output, and it gives a factor matrix and a rotated factor matrix. I always recommend looking at the rotated factor matrix. There are some reasons for that we're not going to get into, but it tends to give you a clearer solution. In this case, it tells us there's 2 factors. Factor 1, the entrepreneurial intensity measures tend to have a very weak correlation. 3 of them have a negative. The last item or question has a positive correlation, but it's really small. Essentially what these numbers represent. However, factor 2, the entrepreneurial intensity measures correlate very highly with factor 2, which indicates factor 2 is in fact entrepreneurial intensity. Same with our flexibility. The opposite of flexibility, they correlate highly with factor 1, which indicates factor 1 is really flexibility, and they correlate hardly at all with factor 2. And so it's telling us, yeah, there are 2 factors, and our questions are associated with the factors we'd expect. This is good. One other thing that we often do before we go and combine these is actually do a reliability analysis, and that is under scale, reliability analysis. Now this is a little tricky. We have to do it individually for what we think each of our proposed measures. So we're going to do it first for our 4 entrepreneurial intensity questions. We want to find alpha. Alpha is just a measure of reliability. It's internal consistency. It tells us that it's basically looking at how people answer these questions. And we expect if someone strongly agrees with the first entrepreneurial intensity question, they're likely to strongly agree, or at least agree with the other ones, right? Because they're asking very similar things. And it kind of tells us how those responses kind of correlate with each other. And for entrepreneurial intensity, we get a Cronbach's alpha of 0.883. And generally, above 0.70, there's different rules of thumb, but above 0.70 is generally sufficient reliability. We'll also quickly run a reliability for the flexibility measure. Take out the intensity ones. You don't want to do them together because it actually will assume they're all the same measure and give you 1 Cronbach's alpha, which you do not want. And when I run the flexibility, I get 0.893. That's very good. And we'll see if I run them, again, the 4 flexibility, that's above 0.70. That's pretty reliable. Same with intensity. If I put them all together, let's just see what happens. Again, this is not what you want to do. But if I just throw the intensity, it might give me a decent alpha, but it shouldn't be as high as the ones individually. It actually does give us a decent Cronbach's alpha, 0.725 with all 8. But again, you don't want to do it that way because you're looking at 2 separate measures, one for flexibility and one for intensity. All right, so this tells us that we can start combining stuff. And I'm going to do a compute variable, and I'm going to create an entrepreneurial intensity measure. And I'm going to create that by just summing all the measures together. Plus, you can plus or hit plus on your keyboard. You can also average them, but I'm just going to add them together. So I created a new measure, and then I'm going to create one for flexibility. By adding those four together. Okay. And it puts them at the end of our data, puts them in our variable view. I'm going to make them scale. They should be interval. And at this point, I can actually do the regression that I want. I want to predict business income using gender, using age, using years in business, as well as intensity and flexibility. Now, things like gender and age, I really wasn't interested in my project. First of all, in my example project, I do not believe I have the flexibility measure even in there. I just added that so you could see how factor analysis would look when I have two measures that are what we call multi-item measures, that are measured by multiple questions, running the factor analysis with both of those. I wanted you to see what that looks like. So in my original paper, I didn't have flexibility. We're going to say that I did, and I had two hypotheses: that entrepreneurial intensity would be positively related to business income, and flexibility. The more flexible an entrepreneur is, the higher their business income. And that kind of makes sense conceptually, and there's some research out there that would support that, which I'd want to cite in my literature review to support those hypotheses. Things like age and years in business and gender, why would I want to include those? Well, they're control variables. They're not really of theoretical interest, but maybe there are things in the past that have been shown to predict business income, and I think they might also be correlated with intensity and flexibility, and thus they could confound the results. There's probably some more control variables I'd want to add to realistically, but those were the ones that kind of came to mind. So, okay, let's make sure everything's legitimate here. Business income. Is that nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio? That's my dependent variable. If I'm using regular OLS regression, whether it's bivariate or multiple, my dependent variable needs to be interval or ratio. Okay, business income is ratio. It's numerical, so that tells me it's one of those two, but it also has a meaningful 0 point. So it is ratio, we're good to go. Let's look at my independent variables. I have flexibility and intensity. Well, given that those are derived from Likert scales, some people would say, those are ordinal. Well, if they're ordinal, we couldn't even combine the questions. If these variables are ordinal, summing them together to create entrepreneurial intensity doesn't make any sense. But we assumed that they were interval because we're using a Likert scale. And again, people tend to view the 5 categories on a Likert scale as equidistant. Thus, if we translate those categories into numbers, the numbers are essentially represent equal distance from each other. All right, so intensity and flexibility are interval, no problems. Years in business, it's ratio. It's numerical, and 0 means 0, right? Same with age. Age is ratio 2, no problem. Gender is nominal, but again, nominal is okay as a independent variable. It's not okay as a dependent with OLS, but it's okay as a independent. I've coded it into a dummy variable, so we're okay there. All right, so let's run it, regression linear, and we are going to predict, and I actually don't know what's going to happen because I don't think I've ran it with the flexibility variable in, but gender, age, years in business, entrepreneurial intensity, flexibility. Yes, I know this this video is on factor analysis, but I want to show you why you use factor analysis. It's often a starting point. If you have multi-question, multi-item measures, it's a starting point. You do it. You make sure that those measures are measuring what you think they're measuring. And that's not exactly what factor analysis totally tells you. We look at face validity, we look at the questions to help assess that. The factor analysis does tell us that, yes, there are 2 distinct factors when we look at the flexibility and entrepreneurial intensity questions, which does help us confirm validity in another way. So interesting, R square 0.22 or 22.2%, not all that high. We're not explaining a lot of variation in salary. And when we look at our results here, we actually find some interesting things. You see a lot of coefficients, but not a lot is actually statistically significant. And that's partially due to our small sample size. We'll talk about that. We have gender, actually a very strong coefficient for gender, which I believe we coded at 1 for males, which means the males are actually earning less than the females. Age is negative, interestingly enough. Years operating the current business is positive. That kind of makes sense. Intensity is positive, and flexibility is positive as well. I should have ran it with confidence intervals. I always forget that. I'm going to rerun it. But yeah, you know, this is what we see in the sample. Can we make inferences to the population? Well, some of these variables we really can't. With gender, even though we get a big coefficient, there's a lot of uncertainty, and the significant is higher than 0.05. So if that's our threshold, we can't really infer that we'd see that relationship, any sort of relationship or any sort of negative relationship in the population. Age in years, not significant. Years operating business, not significant. Intensity is statistically significant, 0.003. Flexibility is not. So not actually a lot going on there. And the confidence intervals just confirm that, confirm what we see here. So. All right, so with that, that's how you use factor analysis and how you can take the results of factor analysis and use those results in a regression model.